What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for MLB Monday, September 6th.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top DFS picks for today's MLB slate.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Okay, guys, we have a 7-game slate today. I got a bunch of good picks for you on this one, so let's get into it. At the pitcher position, I like Brandon Woodruff pitching against the Philadelphia Phillies. Brandon Woodruff is only giving up a .533 OPS versus lefties, and he's facing 5 lefties here today. On top of that, the Phillies have only hit 5 of his last 51 pitches. That's a .098 batting average, and a phenomenal start for Brandon Woodruff versus the Phillies. He's $10,500 FanDuel salary, $900 less on DraftKings, projected at 36.6 fantasy points here tonight. He has an ERA of 2.35. His record is 9-7 on the season, pitching an average of 95 pitches per game, averaging 40 fantasy points per game. He scored 49, 58, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks this is going to be a low-scoring game. 7.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Brandon Woodruff here versus the Philadelphia Phillies. I also like Sonny Gray pitching against a low-salary batting team, the Chicago Cubs. Sonny Gray, he's giving up a .571 OPS versus lefties and a .672 OPS versus righties, facing 3 lefties and 4 righties. And on top of that, the Cubs have only hit 9 of his last 52 pitches. That's a .173 batting average. And Sonny Gray is $9,200 FanDuel salary, $200 less on DraftKings, projected at 29.9 fantasy points here tonight. He has an ERA of 3.89. Record is 7-6 on the season, pitching an average of 86 pitches per game, averaging 30 fantasy points per game, and he scored 24, 46, and 46 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Sonny Gray here versus the Chicago Cubs. Okay, let's take a look at the catcher first base position. Lots of good picks at this position here. I like Pete Alonso with a 24% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Patrick Corbin. Pete Alonso is batting a .834 OPS versus lefty pitchers, and Patrick Corbin, he throws 23% worse to righties as he does lefties, giving up a .886 OPS versus righties. And I like this pick because Pete Alonso is 8 for 27 with a .296 batting average and a 1.091 OPS versus Corbin. 3 of those 8 hits are for home runs. He's $3,500 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.7 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. And he's been on fire, scoring 21, 10, and 22 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Pete Alonso here versus Patrick Corbin. Now I also like Jeimer Candelario with a 29% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Bryce Wilson. Jeimer Candelario is batting a .798 OPS versus righty pitchers, and Bryce Wilson, he pitches his worst ball by far to switch hitters. 45% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.489 OPS versus switch hitters. There's no at-bats versus Wilson yet, and Jeimer Candelario is $3,300 FanDuel salary, $1,500 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 25, 3, and 47 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Jeimer Candelario here versus Bryce Wilson. Okay, here's a value play for you. I like Gary Sanchez with an 11% batting advantage over Hyun-Jin Ryu. Gary Sanchez is batting 10% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .730 OPS versus lefties, and Hyun-Jin Ryu, he's giving up a .656 OPS versus righties. Now, I like this pick because Gary Sanchez is 4 for 10, batting .400 with a 1.855 OPS versus Ryu because 3 of those 4 hits were for home runs and the other one was a double. He's only $2,800 FanDuel salary. He's $1,500 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.1 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 51, 0, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game, so I like Gary Sanchez here versus Hyun-Jin Ryu. So on FanDuel, I'd probably go with Gary Sanchez, but if you're looking for a value play on DraftKings, although the price is good on both sites, it's a much better DraftKings price. Take a look at Carlos Santana with a 49% batting advantage over a low salary pitcher, Zach Lothar. Carlos Santana is batting 7% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .735 OPS versus lefties, and Zach Lothar, he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters, 41% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.750 OPS versus switch hitters. There's no at-bats versus Lothar yet, and Carlos Santana is only $2,700 FanDuel salary, and he's only $300 more on DraftKings. So I love that DraftKings price. Projected at 9.9 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 3, 22, and 9 fantasy points in his last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 10.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Carlos Santana here versus Zach Lothar.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the second base position. I like Alberto Mondesi with a 71% batting advantage over that same low salary pitcher, Zach Lothar. Alberto Mondesi is batting 29% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.179 OPS versus lefties. And we know Zach Lothar, he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters, 41% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.750 OPS versus switch hitters. Adalberto Mondesi is $3,800 FanDuel salary, $1,000 more on DraftKings, projected at 12.5 fantasy points here tonight. He's averaging 17 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 18, 19, and 31 fantasy points in the last 3 games. Vegas thinks there's going to be 10.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. I absolutely love this pick here. Don't tell me he's going to let us down. He's on fire. He's got a phenomenal matchup versus an awful pitcher. I mean, if this guy puts up a 0, I don't know what to tell you. So I like Adalberto Mondesi here versus Zach Lothar. Okay, I also like Javier Baez with a 39% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Patrick Corbin. Javier Baez is batting 15% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .771 OPS versus lefties. And Patrick Corbin, he pitches 23% worse to righties as he does lefties, giving up a .886 OPS versus righties. And Javier Baez is 5 for 17, batting a .294 batting average and a .941 OPS versus Corbin. 2 of those 5 hits are for home runs. He's $3,400 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.2 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's been on fire, scoring 47, 28, and 12 fantasy points in the last 3 games. Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Javier Baez here versus Patrick Corbin. Okay, I also like Kyle Farmer with a 53% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Justin Steele. Kyle Farmer is batting 33% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .869 OPS versus lefties. And Justin Steele, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 20% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .748 OPS versus righties. Now, Kyle Farmer is 1 for 4 versus Steele, and he's $3,000 FanDuel salary, only $300 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.1 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 7 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 0, 6, and 16 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Kyle Farmer here versus Justin Steele. Okay, let's take a look at the third base position. I got a value play for you. I like Ke'Bryan Hayes with a 51% batting advantage over Tarik Skubal. Ke'Bryan Hayes is batting 16% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a 1.012 OPS versus lefties. And Tarik Skubal, he pitches 36% worse to righties as he does lefties, giving up a .842 OPS versus righties. There's no at-bats versus Skubal yet, but I like this pick because Ke'Bryan Hayes is only $2,500 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 11.4 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9, 6, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Ke'Bryan Hayes here versus Tarik Skubal. Okay, who do we have at the shortstop position? I like Alcides Escobar with a 25% batting advantage over Trevor Williams. Alcides Escobar is batting 5% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .704 OPS versus righties. And Trevor Williams, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 19% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .973 OPS versus righties. Alcides Escobar is $3,100 FanDuel salary, $1,500 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.2 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 9 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 12, 20, and 0 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 9.5 runs scored in this game. That's their over-under. So I like Alcides Escobar here versus Trevor Williams. Okay, moving on to the outfield position. I like Robbie Grossman with a 64% batting advantage over a low-salary pitcher, Bryce Wilson. Robbie Grossman, he's batting 19% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .803 OPS versus righties. And Bryce Wilson, he pitches his worst ball by far to switch hitters, 45% worse than his other pitches, giving up a 1.489 OPS versus switch hitters. There's no at-bats versus Wilson yet, and Robbie Grossman is $3,000 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 9, and 26 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Robbie Grossman here versus Bryce Wilson. I also like Akil Baddoo with a 45% batting advantage over that same low salary pitcher, Bryce Wilson. Akil Baddoo is batting 41% better versus righty pitchers, batting a .869 OPS versus righties, and Bryce Wilson is giving up a .831 OPS versus lefties. There's no at-bats versus Wilson yet, and Akil Baddoo is $3,000 FanDuel salary, $700 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.6 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 10 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 18, 0, and 6 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like Akil Baddoo here versus Bryce Wilson. Now I also like Brian Reynolds with a 29% batting advantage over Tarek Skubal. Brian Reynolds, he bats 4% better versus lefty pitchers, batting a .784 OPS versus lefties. And Tarek Skubal, he pitches his worst ball versus switch hitters, 25% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .924 OPS versus switch hitters. Now, Brian Reynolds is 0 for 1 versus Skubal, but he's only $2,900 FanDuel salary, $1,100 more on DraftKings, projected at 10.5 fantasy points here tonight. He's averaging 11 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 54, 0, and 0 fantasy points in his last 3 games. So I like Brian Reynolds here versus Tarek Skubal. I also like JD Martinez with a 6% batting advantage over Ryan Yarborough. JD Martinez is batting a .735 OPS versus lefty pitchers, and Ryan Yarborough, he pitches his worst ball versus righty batters, 13% worse than his other pitches, giving up a .761 OPS versus righties. Now, I like this pick because JD Martinez is 13 for 24, batting a .542 batting average and a 1.660 OPS versus Yarborough. That's a pretty big sample size he's got going on. And JD Martinez is $3,800 FanDuel salary, $1,400 more on DraftKings, projected at 9.8 fantasy points here tonight, averaging 12 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 38, 6, and 3 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I like JD Martinez here versus Ryan Yarborough.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.